Right now in Britain, everyone is accusing everyone else of rigging elections. Well, that's how it can feel. Anyway, the Daily Mail has claimed that Keir Starmer plans to use EU citizens to rig future elections, and the story is based on reports that Starmer plans to give EU citizens the right to vote in national polls. Tory chairman Greg Hands is, for his part, fuming. Labour's plans to give foreign nationals the vote at parliamentary elections is laying the groundwork to drag the UK back into the EU by stealth. Sir Keir spent years trying to block Brexit and overturn the largest democratic vote in this country's history. This is an attempt to rig the electorate to rejoin the EU. The right to vote in parliamentary elections and choose the next UK government is rightly restricted to British citizens and those with the closest historical links to our country. No other EU country allows EU citizens who are not their nationals to vote in parliamentary elections. That reference to those with the closest historical links is because Commonwealth citizens are allowed to vote in national elections in Britain. And the theory being put forward there by Greg Hands is that Keir Starmer wants EU nationals to vote in national elections so that they'll all suddenly vote to rejoin the EU, which to me seems a little bit far-fetched. Asked about that particular policy on LBC, Keir Starmer said this.
Someone has been here, say, 10, 20, 30 years, contributing to this economy, part of our community. They ought to be able to vote. Let me bring it alive. I've obviously knocked on a lot of doors in the last few years, and you go to doors sometimes in general election and you're met with someone who says, look, I'm an EU citizen. I've been living here for 30 years. I'm married to a Brit. My kids were raised and brought up here. They're now working in the UK. I'm even working in lots of community projects, etc. But I can't vote. And I think that feels wrong. Let's just take someone who's been here for 30 years, has literally put down their roots here. As I say, married to a Brit, their kids are here. This is their country. This is where they live. This is where they contribute. I think it's very hard to say, well, you should really be voting back in your country of origin where you haven't been living for 30 years. That actually just doesn't pass the common sense test for me.
Labour are also considering giving 16 and 17-year-olds the vote, about which Keir Starmer said this.
Extending the vote to 16 and 17-year-olds. Again, you're thinking behind that, Sir Keir, because critics would say they can't smoke, they can't drink. I don't think they can get married without mum and dad's permission, but they can vote.
Yeah, they can have babies, they can work, they can join the army. So there are big things you can do at 16 and 17. And again, it's not such an outlandish idea. In Wales, it already happens. In Scotland, it already happens. So again, we're looking at, voting. There's a big policy, because the Labour Party's got lots of rules, there are ways to make policy. There's a big policy-making forum. And these are some of the ideas that are going into the mix, but they're not policy. We're just looking at them.
I've spoken to my press team, and actually they've informed me that 16-year-olds can have babies. I actually kind of agree with the policy. I'm just playing. Tories are, of course, accusing Starmer of rigging votes by expanding the franchise, but it's them who seem committed to actively shrinking it. This month's local elections were the first ever in Britain where photo ID was required, and it seems the worst fears of the critics of that policy have now been confirmed. In Tyne and Wear, almost 1,000 voters were turned away for not having the correct ID. The BBC report that of those, 347 people didn't return to vote. That's people who would have voted who didn't vote. The Guardian reports on a nationwide study from a group called Democracy Volunteers, and that suggests 1.2% of voters were turned away for lacking ID. So the Guardian report this. Democracy Volunteers, a group of election observers, said it conducted snapshot surveys in 118 councils on the 4th of May. The group said observers saw 1.2% of those attending polling stations turned away because they lacked the relevant ID or were judged to not have it. Of those turned away, 53% were identified by observers as appearing to be non-white. The group said its team saw others allowed to vote despite not having ID, so that's pretty controversial. The group, which sent 150 observers, said its staff generally formed teams of 2 or 3 and attended 879 polling stations across all the regions of England. It said these observers spent between 30 and 45 minutes at each location observing the process and then completed a survey for each polling station. Earlier authorities admitted it would not be possible to accurately quantify how many voters lacking ID were turned away on the 4th of May. So you can tell their authorities, the official authorities have said, we're not going to get official statistics on this. So we do have to rely on volunteer groups such as Democracy Volunteers, or however the BBC collected their data. Bringing together these two stories, so the Labour and the Tory sides, or the Labour and the Tory decisions. So one to restrict the franchise, the other to try and expand it. Someone who's commented on both of these is Jacob Rees-Mogg. Speaking to the right-wing National Conservatives conference, he said this.
Parties that try and gerrymander end up finding that their clever scheme comes back to bite them, as, dare I say, we found by insisting on voter ID for elections. And we found that the people who didn't have ID were elderly, and they by and large voted Conservative. So we made it hard for our own voters, and we upset a system that worked perfectly well, was one of the glories of our country, actually, that we did on an honesty basis, when the real problem is with postal voting. So don't get too fretful about random schemes brought up by the socialists, because gerrymandering doesn't really work.
Gerrymandering doesn't really work, and we know because when I was in government, right, he was in cabinet when this was passed. When I was in cabinet, we tried to do it. It backfired because it's actually older people who are struggling to vote. Now, I actually don't think he has evidence for the latter part of that claim, as we've seen with this report from Democracy Volunteers. As I say, the data on this doesn't seem as strong as we might like it to be because this stuff isn't reported on. But they're suggesting that the majority of people turned away were non-white. To me, that doesn't suggest that it's really targeting classic Tory elderly voters. I would dispute Jacob Rees-Mogg saying it has backfired for the Tories, but what he does seem pretty clear about is the intention of the Conservatives when they passed this reform, which was to gerrymander.
Absolutely extraordinary admission from Mogg. And it's already extraordinary and outrageous, that conflation between efforts to expand the franchise, so make it easier for people to vote and include more people in that, and actively restricting people's access to vote. But the most shocking and interesting comment is the fact that he is admitting to gerrymandering, that they have done this intentionally, and when it's not worked in their favour, they've seen it as problematic. I do agree with you about the evidence. It's not that strong as to who has been affected by voter ID and who hasn't. I saw some anecdotal stuff on elderly people, but most of the research has suggested that it would be ethnic minorities that would be most affected. But the real revelation is the admission that this was a policy that was intentionally implemented to restrict access to the franchise. And that's quite the admission. That's quite the feat.